convent smelled like beeswax and withheld breath, cold stone walls soaked in incense and damp shame. By daylight, it was all prayer, posture, and penitence, rows of bowed heads, lips barely moving, fingers twitching through rosary beads, like they were clinging to a ledge. But behind those pale linen veils and sanctified hymns, Saxon nuns lived by a rule much older than Rome, one not written, only whispered, one that touched flesh before it touched spirit. They called it soul union, a ritual of devotion so intimate it could not be named aloud without the candles dimming. It started the way all truly disturbing things do. In innocence, a young novice, barely 15, carried a bowl of water to the altar, her steps careful, her fingers trembling with the weight of sacred tasks, but her eyes, those wide, damp blue eyes, lingered too long on the abbess's hands as they stripped the cloth from the cross, not in admiration, in hunger, not for bread or scripture, but for the curve of a knuckle, the softness of a wrist. In this house of God, no one talked about hunger, especially not that kind. You're watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time. If you enjoy what I dig up for you, subscribe so we don't lose our little historical connection. Thank you. By night, the hall changed. The same floor that echoed with morning prayers, now muffled feet slipping into shadows. The linen was thicker than usual, soaked in myrrh and secrecy. You couldn't smell the sin through all the perfume, but you could hear it, the faintest creak of straw under knees, the rustle of robes pushed aside, the strangled sound of something divine being made profane, or maybe the other way around. Even God would have trouble telling the difference here. They weren't disobeying, not exactly. The rule of Saint Benedict said, "Love thy sisters." It didn't specify how, and in a world where men made the rules and then went off to die in mud for a scrap of crown, women made do with what they had. And what they had was each other. Long fingers and quiet mouths, hair braided so tightly it left marks by morning, devotion that blistered, the kind of communion you couldn't sip from a cup. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the abbess herself led it. With hands once raised in blessing, she now traced crosses into bare skin, murmured scripture against thighs. She called it divine heat, said the soul lived in the spine, and to reach it, one must climb the ladder of flesh. She quoted Solomon as she undressed her novices. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. But no one dared call her blasphemous. She had eyes that turned confession into confession again, and a tongue that could make you forget Latin entirely. No records remain of the rituals, only the side effects. One girl spoke in tongues for 3 days after being anointed. Another refused to sleep on straw again, claiming it scratched her wounds of enlightenment. A third, they say, walked into the chapel naked, dripping with beeswax, saying she'd married Christ and he had taken her fully. They locked her in a cellar. She still sang hymns through the stones. Let's go back a bit. To the scent, that awful, unforgettable scent. Not incense, not candle smoke. Flesh warmed too fast, wax poured too slow. The air was thick with it, holy and revolting, a stew of piety, and something much older, something damp, and beneath it all the faint metallic tang of blood, not from stigmata. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed. They said the walls could talk, but in this convent it was the floor that knew too much. Slabs of stone polished smooth by decades of knees, some bruised from penance, others from ecstasy. You couldn't tell which bruises came from prayer anymore, and maybe that was the point. One nun was caught writing psalms backwards. Another stitched hearts into her scapula where the crucifix should be. When asked to explain, she simply wept. But her tears smelled like rosemary and something else, something slick, something used to anoint, not clean, and yet no one left, no one ran. Because in this place, leaving wasn't escape, it was excommunication, and excommunication was a dry, silent death, far colder than anything they did in the dark. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that they believed it was sacred, that behind every soft moan and shuddering breath was the voice of God, answering back. the line between mysticism and madness, had been erased so gradually. No one remembered drawing it, and now it was gone entirely, swept under folds of wool and sacramental oil, buried beneath hymns, sung with trembling lips and fists clenched around candle wicks, slick with sweat. No act was lustful if the mouth whispered Latin while doing it. That was the loophole, and in Saxon England, loopholes were all the sanctuary women ever had. By the second watch of the night, the walls of the dormitory sweated along with them. Not from heat, but from years of breath caught and exhaled in cycles. The room was never still. One body shifted, another followed, like waves, quiet, deliberate, relentless. Some found hands in the dark before they found faith. Others woke weeping and claimed it was the Holy Spirit. No one corrected them. No one dared. Outside, the wind tore at the shutters like it knew, and perhaps it did. Wolves howled from the trees, branches clawed the stone like fingernails, denied entry. The world was trying to unhear what happened inside, but the stones remembered. Stones always do. Let's go back a bit, to when the Archbishop visited, a rare event, and not without consequence. He brought relics, incense, and a stomach that turned sour the moment he crossed the threshold. Something was wrong, he said. Something in the air. It smelled too sweet, too warm. He blessed every room twice except the west wing, where the novices slept. That one he sealed off entirely, said it gave him dreams he couldn't confess, but he didn't see the trap door. It was under the choir mat, worn thin by barefoot prayers, just wide enough for a girl to slip through, just deep enough to hide shame that sang in harmony. Below, a hidden chamber, no icons, no pews, just cushions stained with oil and heat, mirrors warped by candle smoke, and ropes tied in loops on the wall, not to punish, but to hold. There were carvings too, symbols older than Christ, scratched into the wood in curves that made no theological sense. Spirals, eyes, the shape of a mouth mid-sigh, and chalk, always chalk. White dust smeared across thighs and collars, traced in circles around feet during the ceremony. They said it kept the body in alignment with the soul. They said alignment was everything. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What they did with the bones, animal at first, small, pale, clean, arranged in patterns during the new moon, buried in ash with psalms written in blood across their ribs. Later, the bones were human. Quietly donated, an old nun, half mad, already halfway gone. Her body was burned in the public pyre, but the bones were not in the ashes. They had been kept, preserved, anointed, used, one for each month, passed from hand to hand like relics, but not for worship, for guidance, for warmth, for union, they claimed the marrow still whispered. And sometimes it did. One girl woke screaming, clutching the bone to her chest, said it showed her a garden where Eve never fell. Another swore the bone cured her cough. A third went blind in one eye, but said she could now see angels kissing in the rafters. The abbess approved, said miracles were messy, but something darker was coming. It began when a girl tried to leave. Her name was Adwin, 17, eyes like winter, mouth like flint. She said nothing as she packed, just folded her scapula with trembling fingers and hid a sliver of mirror in her sleeve. She made it past the gates, past the stream, nearly to the edge of the woods. She was found the next morning, face down, skin cold, mouth open, eyes scraped clean. No one spoke of her again. Her name was never mentioned, not even in the prayers for the dead. The abbess claimed she'd been taken by wolves, but the wounds said otherwise. No bite marks, just burns, small, precise, shaped like crosses turned sideways. And in her clenched fist, they found the sliver of mirror and carved into it one word, lie. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the mirror disappeared. Not taken, not buried, not even burned, just gone. One day it sat in the chapel's offering bowl, glinting beneath a strip of linen lace. The next morning the bowl was empty. Not even the dust remained. The sisters whispered that it had been reclaimed by the spirit world or by something much closer. The abbess didn't ask where it went. She only nodded once, turned to the altar, and began to hum a hymn that no one recognised and no one ever dared repeat. From that moment forward, a new ritual began. It was called the Vigil of Touch. It wasn't in any scroll, no ecclesiastical record held it, but it happened every seventh night, beneath the hourglass moon, when the wind whistled sideways through the nave and the candles leaned in like they were eavesdropping. The bells did not ring, instead a single note was hummed, low, vibrating, pulled deep from the belly, not the throat. The nuns stood in a circle around the altar, veils removed, eyes closed, hands joined not at the wrist but at the waist, palm to navel. They stood in silence until one of them, always a different one, began to tremble. That was the sign. That was the calling. They moved as one, flesh to flesh, breath to breath. Mouths never opened, but everything else did. Let's go back a bit to the scriptorium, where Sister Ealdgifu once spent her days copying psalms until her fingers bled. She had the smallest hands in the convent and the most beautiful script. For years, her words were praised by bishops, blessed by monks, sent to other abbeys as proof of the convent's divine discipline. But something changed. Her letters began to curve unnaturally. The O's swelled into full moons, the M's twisted like serpent coils. She began to write in pairs, one hand mirroring the other, left and right dancing in symmetrical madness across the parchment. She said God had split himself in her spine. Her final manuscript was seized by the abbess. No one saw it again. But the rats did. They swarmed the library that night. Died in a circle around her desk. 12 in total, all with their eyes missing. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what Sister Aldith confessed, not to a priest, not even to the abbess, but to the icon of St. Agnes in the cloister garden. She was found on her knees, forehead pressed to the base of the statue, her voice dry from speaking through the night. When they pulled her away, she screamed. Not words. Notes, a strange chant in intervals too exact for human mouths. Her lips bled from the strain. She said the statue had kissed her back, that it had breathed, that its tongue tasted like rosewood and ruin. They sealed the garden the next morning, but the statue still sweats in the rain, and the moss around its feet grows in spirals no one can explain. But something darker was coming. The novices began to faint. One by one, not from hunger or fasting, though both were common, but from dreams. Dreams so vivid, so physical, that they awoke bruised, bitten, sometimes bleeding between the thighs, though none of them had been touched while asleep, at least not by anything visible. They spoke of golden doors and smoke-lit corridors, of hands made of candle wax and mouths that tasted like scripture dipped in honey and salt. One girl claimed she'd been given a baby made of light. Another said her womb was on fire, but it didn't hurt. It sang. The abbess began to sleepwalk. At first it was simple, wandering through the chapel, murmuring prayers that didn't belong to any known rite. Then it escalated. She was found one morning standing on the roof, arms outstretched, completely nude beneath the rising sun, her body covered in script, not written, branded as if the heat of divine fury had etched words directly into her flesh. No one could read them. The language twisted, letters morphed mid-glance. A scholar was brought from the nearby priory to decipher them. He took one look, screamed, and bit off his own tongue. He died 3 days later. The abbess never explained. She simply returned to her chambers, bathed in cold milk, and ordered 3 new candle stands carved from bone. And they were carved without question, because by then the convent had stopped pretending. They weren't nuns anymore. They were something older, something raw, something holy, only in the way that fire is holy when it burns everything you love and still makes you bow before it. Because by then the convent had stopped pretending. The prayers were still chanted, yes, but now they sounded like invocations, like spells muttered through teeth clenched in ecstasy or terror. No one could quite tell. The incense was thicker, almost suffocating, a mixture of frankincense, myrrh, crushed elder bark, and something else, sweet, sharp, and strangely familiar. Some said it was powdered milk teeth, others whispered it was dried blood, ground so fine it floated, and no one could explain why the flames in the sanctuary lanterns sometimes burned black, flickering like they were trying to scream. The rituals intensified. They no longer waited for night. Noon became sacred. Heat became holy. The sun pouring through the stained glass was no longer a blessing, but a spotlight. They stood beneath it, robes open to the waist, arms raised, bodies slick with oil and breath. Eyes rolled back as they spoke in tongues that sounded older than language itself. Union, they called it. Communion of flesh. There was no more shame, only service. Let's go back a bit. To Sister Hilda, a woman of 63 winters, silent for the last 10, once believed deaf, perhaps mute. But one afternoon she stood in the garden and began to sing. Not hymns, not human melodies. Her song was a vibration, a frequency that made the soil ripple and the doves fall from the sky mid-flight. Her voice cracked open something in the earth, not metaphorically, literally. A fissure split the ground beneath the rosemary bush, revealing a shallow cavity lined with bone fragments, tiny, delicate, definitely human. Children's bones, arranged like spokes in a wheel, and at the centre, a single tooth wrapped in linen. No one asked whose it was, they simply covered it again, and added lavender to mask the rot. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What they did to the relics, sacred objects brought by travellers, gifted by bishops, displayed with trembling reverence, St. Crispin's sandal, the finger of St. Eadbert, a tear vial allegedly filled by Mary Magdalene herself. They weren't displayed anymore. They were used, during rites, during touch, during what the abbess now called the kiss of grace. The sandal was rubbed along spines, the finger was dipped in honey and pressed to tongues. The tear vial emptied. Refilled, with what, no one dared confirm, and the sacred texts, they were rewritten, not erased, no, they were too careful for that. Instead, letters were inverted, turned, mirrored, margins filled with annotations that spiralled like ivy, thick with words not found in any known dialect. Sister Sinethrith, once a scribe, swore the new script came to her in dreams. Dreams where a woman made of light and ash whispered secrets into her ear while braiding her hair with thorns. She woke with welts along her scalp and ink under her fingernails. The ink was red, but not ink, but something darker was coming. It began with the animals. The mice stopped running. They sat in the open, blinking slowly. The crows, once noisy, went silent. The cats disappeared altogether. Birds no longer nested in the chapel eaves. One night, the bell tower was found coated in feathers. Hundreds, maybe thousands, pressed flat against the stone, as if something enormous had burst apart inside it. And when Sister Leofrin climbed the ladder to investigate, she never came down. They found her boots, nothing else. Then came the sky. For 3 mornings in a row, the sunrise bled. Literally. The eastern horizon turned the colour of clotted meat, and a rain of thin red mist fell upon the convent garden. The sisters called it the anointment. They caught it in bowls, bathed in it. One girl drank a full goblet, and did not speak for a week, only smiled, her teeth pink and glistening. When asked what it tasted like, she wrote a single word on her wall: return. No one asked what she meant, they knew. The abbess declared the blood mist a sign that heaven was opening, that the old ways, the true ways, were returning through their mouths and hands and wombs. She stood on the steps of the cloister, robes billowing in the crimson dawn, and declared that the marriage of spirit and vessel was almost complete. The sky cracked with thunder, and something answered, not loud, not yet, but it vibrated beneath their feet, like a beast waking from under the chapel, and every sister dropped to her knees, not in prayer, but in anticipation, because the veil between worlds wasn't thinning anymore. It was splitting. Down the centre of the convent's silence, something was cracking. Not loudly, but constantly, like the sound of wet parchment being torn very slowly in a distant room. The sisters could feel it in their bones, in the ache behind their teeth, in the way candle flames bent toward the floor instead of up. The air no longer moved in breaths. It pulsed, thick, humid, scented with rosewater and rust. One girl said it smelled like her mother's mouth on the day she died. No one corrected her. The abbess stopped sleeping. She claimed rest was for the untouched, for those whose bodies were still closed. She walked barefoot now, toes black with ash, robes open at the chest as if her skin alone could conduct the divine. She spoke less, sang more, long, low notes that never seemed to end. Some said she no longer breathed between them. Others swore she did not need to. Let's go back a bit, to the new arrival. Her name was Eanswith, a baker's daughter from the edge of the Wye, sent to the convent for being too wild, which in Saxon England meant she danced under a full moon once and refused a priest's hand without pretending to be sorry. She came barefoot, bruised from travel, her lips cracked and her hands still dusted with flour. When she crossed the threshold of the cloister gate, every bird within a mile fell silent. The bell tolled twice, though no one pulled the rope, and the moment the abbess saw her, she whispered, "The vessel has come." Eanswith didn't know what that meant. She would. The other sisters watched her with reverence and fear. They did not speak to her. They did not sit near her, but they followed her. Every step, every breath, they memorized like scripture. Her bed was not in the dormitory, but in the altar room. Her meals were left on a silver tray no one had seen before. She never touched them. She said she wasn't hungry, that something inside her was feeding off light and touch and the sound of whispered prayers from the walls. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What happened to the icons? At first it was subtle. The painted eyes of St. Hilda began to weep. Not blood, not water, but something like milk curdled with honey. The smell was sweet, rancid, unforgettable. Then came the smiles. Virgin Mary, once sorrowful, now grinned with teeth too perfect, too many. Crucifixes warped, their beams curving inward, like they were trying to embrace the air. Christ's wounds healed themselves. The nails disappeared, only the holes remained, deep and echoing, like wells carved into paint. One sister placed her ear to one, and swore she heard moaning from the canvas. The abbess forbade all mention of it. She said it was blasphemy to fear revelation, and something darker was coming. Eanswith began to speak in twos. Her voice doubled, not layered, but mirrored. Two tones opposite in pitch echoed from her mouth at once, one high and fluttering like a wounded sparrow, the other low and cold as riverbed stone. She began to mark her own skin with chalk symbols while she slept. Spirals, arrows, eyes with no pupils. Her fingertips bled, but she never flinched. During Mass, she stared into the altar flame until her pupils vanished. "It is coming through me," she whispered one night, "and I will not tear." The sisters didn't ask what she meant. They simply began preparing. They cleared the altar, removed the relics, washed the floor with wine, not water. The walls were lined with mirrors now, all covered in linen, waiting. Candles were replaced hourly, never allowed to burn to the end. A tub was brought in, filled with milk, herbs, and something the abbess refused to name. They called it the Basin of Welcoming. They began singing over it at dusk, songs with no lyrics, just vowels, stretched until they cracked, repeated until the lips bled, and at the centre of it all, Eanswith waited. Not with fear, with joy, because the flesh was ready, and the thing beneath the chapel was beginning to rise. It didn't roar, it didn't quake, it breathed, slowly, rhythmic. A breath that made the flagstones throb, and the sconces flicker, and the sisters sway, as if rocked by a mother too ancient to remember. The entire convent pulsed like a wound healing wrong. You could taste it in the air. Coppery, thick, like the moment before you bite your tongue in your sleep, like metal and sweat and prayer. The abbess stood above the altar with her arms outstretched, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from effort. She was holding something back or calling it closer. Her mouth moved constantly, lips dry and cracked, mumbling syllables that sounded half Saxon, half wind. Her feet bled from standing too long, but she didn't notice, not when the stones beneath her began to sweat. Let's go back a bit, to the dream that started it all. Not the first dream, the original, the forbidden one. It came to Sister Geetha, a quiet woman who once spoke only in scripture and never without washing her hands. She dreamed she was a root buried deep, warmed by rot. Above her something vast bloomed. Not a flower, not a tree, but a body, arched and radiant, with eyes in places no human should have them. It smiled at her through the soil and whispered, "Make room." When she awoke, her sheets were soaked and her stomach was carved with the word "open" in tiny perfect letters. She didn't scream. She simply got up, dressed, and began digging beneath the chapel with her bare hands. She did not stop for 3 days. They let her. On the third night, her fingers broke through a stone tile that rang like bone. That's when the breathing began. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What happened to the records? The convent once kept immaculate archives, baptisms, deaths, donations, relic provenance, saintly visions, all gone, not burned, not stolen, gone. The shelves remained. So did the catalogues, but the parchments had vanished. Every scroll, every inked skin, every vellum scrap, erased as if exhaled. In their place were feathers, hundreds of feathers, all white, all damp, all marked with tiny bloody fingerprints. The archivist was found curled beneath her desk, hair gone, teeth gone, eyes wide open, but entirely black. She hummed when touched, she still does. No one speaks to her, not anymore, and something darker was coming. The ground split open fully on the eve of the equinox. Not with fire, but with silence, a deafening, dense nothing that dropped into the room like a stone into milk. All candles extinguished, all sound fled. The sisters collapsed, every single one. Some wept, others moaned, most simply lay still, eyes fluttering as if dreaming on fast forward. The abbess did not fall, she remained standing, robes now soaked through with something that wasn't water. She walked into the hole in the floor, without a word, vanishing into the dark like she had done it before. And maybe she had. The hole breathed. That's the only word for it. Air moved in and out in soft gulps, like lungs remembering how to want. The sisters rose slowly, one by one, as if called. None spoke. They moved toward the basin, dipped their hands, anointed their lips, their breasts, their thighs, their eyes rolled back. One by one, they stepped forward and whispered into the hole. What they said was never recorded, but it wasn't prayer. Then Eansworth stepped forward. She was glowing, not metaphorically. Her skin shimmered with something golden, pulsating faintly with each breath. She held the mirror, the one that had vanished. It was whole again, clean. She placed it over the hole, and it shattered, but not from impact, from reflection. The shards floated, just for a moment. Then they descended into the dark. The breathing stopped, and the abbess spoke from below, but her voice wasn't hers anymore. It echoed like a wind through ribs, like the first sound a body makes after burial, and every sister smiled. Not with joy, with obedience, because the thing beneath the chapel had spoken, and its first command was begin. The sisters did not hesitate, not out of trust, not even out of fear, but because their bodies were no longer entirely theirs. Something inside them moved in time with the voice, something ancient and serpentine that hummed behind their eyes and twitched in their wombs. They formed a circle without instruction. Eansworth stood at the centre, her skin flickering with that unnatural gold sheen, her mouth slightly open, breath held like she was afraid it might burn on the way out. The altar had been stripped to its bones. No cloth, no icons, just raw stone and cracked wax pooled like melted flesh. Around it, the shards of the shattered mirror arranged themselves, moving on their own, crawling into a spiral that pulsed with heat. Every time a shard clinked into place, a sister gasped as though something inside her had snapped tight. Let's go back a bit, to the bells, once used to signal prayer, now silent for 40 days. No one pulled them, no one could. Their ropes had withered overnight, turned brittle like sun-bleached sinew. The bell metal itself blackened. veins of red spreading across the surface like rot under skin. When the wind blew, they groaned, not a chime, but a warning, a sound like bones grinding in a clenched jaw. And yet the sisters had stopped noticing. They heard something else now, a constant hum, subsonic, intimate, like the voice of God, if God had no lungs but whispered anyway. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what they did with the bones, the ones from the reliquary, the ones from under the garden, the ones that were never supposed to be touched. They were laid out around the spiral, bleached, scrubbed, oiled, each one tied with silk thread, and smeared with the red wax of extinguished candles. They called them keys. No one said what they unlocked. They didn't have to. Eanswythe took one in each hand, placed them over her own chest, and began to speak. But it wasn't English. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't any human tongue. Her voice dropped into a register that vibrated the teeth of anyone listening. The walls shook, the candles flared. One nun dropped to her knees and began vomiting salt water. Another tore her robe and scratched the word Amen into her thighs with a sharpened rib. Still no one stopped her, because something darker was coming. It began with the floor. The stone around the mirror spiral cracked outward, forming a jagged ring of fractures that bled steam. The smell was unbearable. Boiled milk, burnt feathers, and the cloying sweetness of decay dressed in perfume. The spiral pulsed. It had a heartbeat, not fast, slow, terrifyingly slow, as if whatever waited below was not hurried, as if it had all the time in the world, and had already waited centuries. Then the lights changed, not dimmed, not brightened, shifted. Colours that had no name flickered across the chapel. Walls bled shadow. Skin turned translucent for moments at a time. You could see veins move, bones twitch, hearts stutter. Eanswythe's eyes were entirely white now, but she wasn't blind. She was looking into something no one else could see, and it was looking back. She opened her mouth and screamed, except no sound came, only light. It poured from her throat in a beam so sharp it split the spiral, and from that crack a hand emerged, not a human hand, not an animal hand, a thing made of many fingers, all jointed wrong, all glistening with wet light and ash. It reached for Eanswythe, and she stepped into its grasp like a child returning home. The sisters sang, loud now, not with melody, but with unity. Not a choir, an engine. Their voices fed whatever was rising. Their breath was fuel, their bodies instruments. The hand withdrew into the hole, taking Eanswythe with it. The spiral sealed behind her, but her voice remained. It echoed from beneath the floor, from within their mouths, from behind their eyes, and what it said was simple. More. A word that didn't echo, it embedded. It sunk into the walls, the robes, the marrow of every woman in that chapel, like rot into fruit. More wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was a hunger, given shape, given voice, given permission. And once it was spoken, the sisters knew. The rites they'd performed were not the end. They were just the appetizer. The main ritual, the true offering, hadn't even begun. The spiral was closed but not sealed. It pulsed beneath their feet with each breath, like the earth itself had a heartbeat now, and the nuns moved like blood cells in a fevered body, purposeful, flushed with heat, obeying without thought. Every one of them had heard that voice inside their own chest more. The abbess was the first to act. She returned from the crypt not walking, but gliding. Her feet no longer touched the stone. Her veil was gone. Her hair was wet, not with water, with something that shimmered and steamed, something that smelled like honey, left too long in the sun. Her eyes were not hers anymore. No pupils, just silver discs with no edges. When she opened her mouth, insects spilled out. Tiny, white, fluttering, moth-like. They vanished mid-air. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She pointed, and the sisters obeyed. Let's go back a bit to the manuscripts they'd hidden. Not the Gospels, not the Psalters, the others, the ones written on calfskin stretched too thin, with ink that shimmered red under moonlight and black under sun. Bound in hair, clasped with teeth, they'd been buried behind the library wall, sealed with wax and bone. Sister Frith recovered them without breaking stride. Her fingers didn't bleed when she touched the pages, but her nose did. A thin stream that she licked without blinking. She laid them on the altar, like newborns. And that's when the learning began. The books did not teach, they entered. Each sister took one and began to read aloud. Not words, not syllables, but vibrations. The air rippled with every line, and the walls bled symbols no one had carved. Some fell to the ground convulsing, eyes wide, mouths foaming. Others simply stood, arms raised, robes open, letting the voices pass through them like wind through branches. One burst into flame. She did not scream. The others sang louder over her burning. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what they did to the guests, because of course the convent still received travellers, messengers, priests. A young monk from Canterbury arrived with scrolls and a blessing. He was invited to stay the night, given warm food, shown the chapel. He didn't ask questions, though the air smelled wrong, and the silence watched him. That night, he was taken to the cloister garden to pray. He never left. In the morning, his robe was folded on the chapel steps. Inside it, his tongue, his ring finger, and a note written in ash that read, "Do not send another without first offering your neck." The church didn't respond, not because they didn't know, but because the sky over that convent never quite looked right anymore. And something darker was coming. It began in the bellies. Sister Athelburr was the first. Her stomach swelled over 3 days. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't lain with anyone. No one had. Not in the traditional sense, but she moaned in her sleep. Whispered names no one had taught her. Her skin turned translucent. Veins pulsed with gold. On the 7th day, she birthed something that was not a child. It was light, dense, screaming light. It burned through the straw. Through the stone, through her, she did not survive, but she smiled when it happened. More followed. One by one the sisters were overcome, swollen, transfigured, opened. The chapel floor, once clean, became slick with the residue of revelation. The scent of it clung to the walls. Like meat turned holy, they called it harvest, not because it fed them, but because it was planting something else. The soil in the garden turned red. The trees bent toward the chapel. The moon refused to rise. The air tasted like breath exhaled from too many mouths, and through it all the spiral pulsed, calling, waiting, like it was inhaling the world one breath at a time. The ground itself seemed to lean in closer, the very geometry of the convent bending slightly toward that point in the chapel where the mirror had once shattered. And the sisters responded not with fear, but with choreography. They no longer moved as people. They moved as one organism, limbs guided by instinct, by ritual, by the pull of something that had no name but every purpose. Silence wasn't silence anymore. It was saturated, alive, humming with the echo of things not yet born, but already hungry. You could hear it in the pipes, in the walls, under the altar, the wine of flesh stretching to accommodate the divine, or something that called itself that. The abbess didn't speak for days. She simply stood before the altar, her hands blistered from touch, her chest covered in scripture that appeared overnight, lines crawling across her skin like inked worms, reshaping with every blink. She didn't eat, she didn't drink, but she grew, taller, thinner. Her fingers elongated, her voice, when she finally used it, came out like 2 stones grinding together in a flood. "Bring the lanterns," she said. "Let's go back a bit." To the lanterns, not oil, not wax. These were made from bone, hung with skin. The wicks were braided hair, soaked in fat rendered from the remains of the first offering. Ian's withs. Her bones had been exhumed days after her ascension. They were blackened but whole, hollow, as if something had sipped her dry. They rang when struck. Each sister carried a lantern. They lit them with the blood wax from their own fingers. The chapel glowed a sickly orange, as if it had been set on fire and held mid-blaze. They called this light truth. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the truth revealed. The walls were never just stone. With the lanterns raised, carvings emerged, faces twisted, screaming, hundreds of them, some half-formed, others ancient, not saints, not sinners, witnesses, etched into the walls with something sharp and deliberate, and their eyes moved, slowly, tracking each sister, as if remembering them, as if judging, but the sisters didn't look away, they stared right back. The altar stone began to bleed, not gush, drip, steady. Clear fluid at first, then thick, red-black. The spiral opened again, this time without a sound. The stones pulled apart like crusty lips. From beneath came a light, soft and pulsing, like the heartbeat of something miles wide. The sisters surrounded it. They did not chant, they did not sing. They simply breathed in unison, long, slow, trembling breaths that echoed into the pit, and then one of them jumped. Not fell, jumped willingly, laughing. Her name was Wulfgith. She had once been the convent's healer. Now she dove into that spiral with arms wide, body arching in bliss. There was no scream, no splash, only a single sustained note. Like a bell rung from inside the earth, another followed, then another. By dawn, 7 had gone, and something darker was coming. Not death, not demons, a wedding. That's what they called it, the great consummation, the joining of what was once above with what had always waited below. The spiral was not a gate, it was an altar, a bed, a womb. The veil was not thinning, it was being removed, and the thing beneath was not invading, it was returning. The abbess led the procession at sunset, robes gone, skin covered in soot and gold, her body trembling as if barely containing the weight of her new role. She said nothing, just raised her arms, and the chapel doors locked themselves shut, not with iron, but with roots. Yes, roots, thick, pale, fibrous things that grew across the wood, like veins under skin. No one inside screamed, they wept, because finally, after centuries of waiting, the bridegroom had come, and the sisters had been so very ready. They'd scrubbed every surface with their own blood, bathed in the breath of the thing beneath, turned their bodies into vessels, and their mouths into flutes of worship. They had fasted not for purity, but to hollow themselves out, to be filled, to be used, to be consumed. If that's what he wished, because he was not just a god, he was the end of asking. The spiral throbbed open again, wider this time, like a mouth stretching for a final kiss. From the depth came music, not sung, not played, just there, vibrating inside their ribs, their spines, their wombs. The melody was impossible to follow, half longing, half command. It made your skin crawl and ache at the same time, and still, no one looked away. The abbess stepped into the centre, her spine arched, her fingers twisted into sigils of welcome. Her lips cracked with heat, her eyes steamed. She reached down and touched the stone. It pulsed under her palm. Let's go back a bit, to the first time they used the chalice. It had been found buried under the sacristy, wrapped in wool, sealed in wax. It was small, blackened, covered in carvings of women without faces. They didn't question it. They washed it with their tongues, filled it with a mixture of milk, blood, and the sap from the tree that grew in the graveyard without permission. When drunk, it made time bend, fingers vanish, voices multiply. They passed it from hand to hand until none remembered whose lips had started the rite. They called it the first mouth, because it had taught them how to open. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What happened to Sister Theodrith? She had always been afraid, even when they'd all turned, even when the chapel became something no architect would claim. She'd stayed quiet. She'd pretended, but fear is a scent, and he smelled it. The night before the wedding she tried to leave, packed only a cross and a shoestring rosary. She made it to the outer wall before the earth swallowed her legs. Not metaphor, literal. The soil turned black beneath her. Her feet sank, then her knees, then her hips. She screamed, the roots wrapped around her ribs. They didn't drag her down. They pulled her open. When the sisters found her remains, they weren't whole. They were organised. Her spine was strung through the gate like a garland. Her skull had been planted in the herb garden, already sprouting crocus. No one cried. The abbess smiled. She said, He has standards. And something darker was coming. The final sign. The bell tower cracked. Not from weather, not from age. From within. The bell itself screamed. Not a toll, a shriek, metal folded. Stone wept. And from the shattered tower, feathers rained down again. But this time, they weren't white. They were red. Not dyed, bleeding. Each feather dripped. Each one burned the skin. The sisters gathered them anyway, laughing as they blistered. The abbess took the spiral's edge and stepped back. "It is time," she whispered. Her voice wasn't hers. It came from her throat, but it wore someone else's hunger. The spiral began to rise. Not something from below, something that was the chapel, the ground, the history, the waiting. It wasn't a beast. It wasn't a god. It was need, made flesh, made whisper, made truth. The room bent, the air thickened. One by one, the sisters dropped to their knees. Some tore their skin with their nails, some bit their own tongues until they choked. One simply floated, humming with bloodless bliss. They weren't offering themselves anymore. They were the offering, and the bridegroom reached for them with 1,000 mouths, and everyone said, yes. Yes to the heat, the hunger, the ancient ache that had grown fat on centuries of silence. Yes to being undone, not destroyed. To being rewritten, not erased. Yes to becoming more than nuns, more than women, more than bodies dressed in devotion. The mouths didn't kiss, they absorbed, they inhaled, they knew. Every secret, every shame, every moment of trembling doubt scrawled across the inside of their bones. And they welcomed it. Not out of love, out of purpose, because now, finally, they were instruments. Chords of a song hummed by something older than language and louder than God. The spiral didn't spin, it thrummed, pulsing with radiant decay, cracking the stone floor into hexes. The abbess hovered above it, robeless, skin etched with constellations that shifted when she moved. Her eyes were black holes. Not metaphorically, literally, light disappeared into them. Her mouth opened, and from it came not voice but gravity. Let's go back a bit. To the last day the world remembered them. A merchant passed by the convent at dusk. He didn't enter, he didn't speak. He simply stopped on the road, stared, and began to bleed from the eyes. His horse reared, turned, and ran straight into the river. The merchant screamed just one word before his throat collapsed inward. Wrong. That night, the stars above the convent blinked out in sequence. One by one, as if looking away, the church sent a letter. It was returned, unread, sealed with teeth. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What happened to the sky? It folded, a wrinkle in the heavens directly above the convent. Not storm, not cloud, something peeled. The sun refused to pass over. The moon circled it like prey. At night, instead of stars, there were eyes, open, closed, winking in unison, tracking the movements of the spiral. The air turned thick, hard to swallow. One of the sisters inhaled too deeply and began to choke on what she said was a name that had no vowels. She died smiling. The spiral accepted her like breath drawn between notes, and something darker was coming. Not a beast, not a god, but a memory of what the world had been before it decided to forget. The chapel's architecture began to shift, not crumble, reshape. Walls curled inward, arches inverted, the altar split down the centre and birthed a second spiral, smaller, humming like a child learning to cry. The ground beneath the pews turned to ash, the pews themselves to bone. Every symbol carved in that space, cross, dove, lamb, morphed into a mirror of pain. Open mouths, grasping hands, eyes leaking gold. The abbess began to float higher. She wasn't speaking anymore. She was conducting. The nuns responded in waves, their bodies bending in perfect arcs, some upright, some on all fours, others curled into fetal positions of devotion. They hummed, not with their mouths, with their teeth. Their jawbones trembled, their molars clacked rhythmically, their tongues split to accommodate the song. Blood dripped from their ears, and they welcomed it like baptism. Then came the first gift. The spiral opened a final time, not downward, but upward. A column of heat rose, blinding and silent. From it stepped something not quite human. A child. Genderless, skin like cracked marble, eyes like burnt honey, mouth sealed with a single thread. It looked at each sister and nodded. Then it took the abbess's hand and pressed its head to her chest. She exploded, not with gore, with light, blinding, blistering truth that filled the chapel, seared the walls, and carved the phrase, "He is remembered," into the stone above the door. The child turned to ash, the spiral sang, and the rest of the world continued, blissfully unaware, as the convent disappeared from maps, from memory, from mercy, because that was only the beginning, and he was still hungry. The spiral had pulsed itself raw, a gaping mouth of heat and memory beneath the chapel's fractured heart. The abbess was gone. Yes, but gone in the way smoke leaves a fire. It lingers. Her voice echoed without source, whispering through stone, threading through the veins of every sister, like a haunting too intimate to escape. She had become a direction, a promise, and they followed. Their skin bore new marks, glowing faintly, lines that shifted beneath the surface, like thoughts trying to become flesh. None of them questioned the pain. Pain was proof. Pain was the ink he wrote with. Let's go back a bit, to Sister Winflade. She'd once tended bees before the spiral, before the mouths. She spoke little, smiled less, and understood hives better than humans. But after the birthing of the light child and the abbess's ascension, something in her changed. She began humming, not songs but frequencies. At first birds responded, circling the convent in panicked flight. Then the walls, then the bones in the reliquary, which clicked in rhythm with her breath. Then she stopped being one. Her body sloughed its shape over 3 days, dissolving gently, like wax in warm air. What remained was a swarm. Thousands of tiny, glistening things, with no wings, no legs, no eyes, just heat. They moved as one. They pulsed in the shape of her, spoke in her voice but deeper, wet like sound made underwater. "I see now," she buzzed. "He is not arriving, he is unfolding. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear." What unfolded next? The spiral turned red, not coloured, lit, like a forge deep beneath the crust had exhaled directly into it. The ground became slick, like breathing through a tongue, and then it cracked wider, not violently, seductively. The stone folded back like curtains, and from the centre rose a tree, or something pretending to be one. Its bark was flesh, its leaves, stitched vellum from forgotten Bibles, its roots twitched and curled like toes in ecstasy. It smelled like myrrh and sweat and dying roses. The nuns surrounded it instantly. They fell to their knees and chanted not with words but with movements, rolling, clawing, pulsing. Sister Edgith was the first to approach. She kissed its trunk. It bled, and when she tasted it, she began to weep molten gold. That was when they understood. This was not a symbol. This was him, and something darker was coming, because the tree was not done growing, not upward, inward. Each root sought out a sister, curled around her limbs, pressed into her mouth, her eyes, her wounds. It didn't devour. It read. It read them like scripture, like psalms recited backward, until they made sense again. And as each sister was read, she changed. They grew extra ribs. They blinked sideways. They spoke in loops, repeating one another's thoughts before they were spoken. Time began to smear. A second became an hour. A night became a century of moaning. One sister died 3 times in a single prayer, and was reborn as a spiral of glass that sang her name, in reverse, and the tree grew. It bloomed with fruit, soft, pulsing sacs that hung low and burst when touched. Inside, not seeds, but memories, fragments of the world as it had been. Stone altars, lambs, first kisses, cradles rocked by dead grandmothers, the taste of butter on burnt bread. Each fruit contained a life unlived, offered back like apologies. The sisters ate them all and forgot themselves, because he was not only rewriting the present, he was erasing the past, one bite at a time. The sisters no longer remembered their names, not the ones given at birth, not the ones spoken in prayer. They didn't need them. Their identities had been stripped like bark from a limb, revealing something raw, wet, and endlessly receptive. They communicated now in gestures and pulses, in breath and tremor. Words were too slow, too human. The tree fed them, not just with memory fruit, but with images. Every twitch of a branch sent visions cascading through the chapel. Visions of before language, before shape, before women were expected to kneel without knowing what for. The spiral pulsed beneath it all, not forgotten, just watching. Like an eye sealed shut in orgasmic patience. Let's go back a bit, to the mother cellar. It had once been used to store pickled fish and salted herbs, a place of ordinary decay, but now it throbbed with heat, moist and cavernous, lined with roots that pulsed like arteries, a chamber transformed. The walls were soft, like flesh under gauze, and the air smelled of milk curdled with incense. One sister, Anselm, wandered down in trance and never came back, but her voice did. Days later, they heard her laughter behind the walls, then her breathing, then her heartbeat, loud, constant. She was the room now. They called it the womb, and fed it with songs about pain. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What they did to the crucifix. It hadn't been touched during the early rituals, perhaps out of respect, or fear, or oversight. But one night, the tree dropped a fruit that didn't burst. It hissed, wrinkled, hardened. Inside was a nail, not rusted, but warm, still echoing with a scream that hadn't happened yet. The sisters knew what to do. They took the old crucifix down from above the altar, carried it to the spiral, and laid it in the tree's shade. It withered, not rotted, aged, turned to splinters before their eyes, screaming like wood giving up a secret. In its place they raised a new form. Not a cross, a mirror, polished obsidian rimmed with tongues, mounted upside down. When they looked into it, they didn't see themselves. They saw what watched them, and it was smiling, and something darker was coming. Sister Tinnaber began to glow from within. Her skin thinned, veins gleaming silver under stretched parchment. Her voice deepened. "I remember him," she whispered. Before the world had words for fear, she no longer walked. She floated. The spiral called her anchor, the tree called her bride, the chapel called her home. On the 21st night, she birthed a second spiral from her own chest. Not metaphor, flesh split open without blood, bone curled back like petals. The hole within her revealed stone, deep, carved, already breathing. She didn't scream, she sang, and the sound bent the world around it. Candles screamed, mirrors fogged. One sister turned to salt mid-prayer, another melted, laughing, the rest bowed, lips touching the floor, tongues tasting ash and sanctity. From her chest spiral rose a mouth, small, toothless, blind, but it whispered truths that made eyes bleed. They listened, because they were no longer afraid. Fear had become irrelevant. The chapel was no longer a place, it was a process, a transformation, a wound being licked clean from the inside out. And the spiral grew wider, because more was coming, always more. Hunger does not pause when fed, it evolves. Deep within the chapel-turned throat, reality loosened like a jaw unhinged. The floor no longer held firm, it breathed, the walls no longer stood. They leaned in, pressing close, sticky with condensation that tasted like blood diluted in candle wax. The tree above the spiral extended new limbs, ones with knuckles and fingernails, swaying in time with a heartbeat that no longer belonged to any one body. There was no more sleep, not because they stayed awake, but because time had forgotten how to divide itself. The sisters existed in states, not hours, transfixed, transformed, terrified, but only in a way that thrilled. Let's go back a bit. To the relics, once stored reverently behind locked oaken cabinets, a splinter of the true cross, a finger of St. Agnes, the veil of a martyred virgin, now fed to the spiral. One by one, lowered into the wound with ritual and reverence, the relics did not vanish. They reacted. The cross splinter burst into ivy, wrapping around a nun's neck and blooming thorns down her spine. The finger melted into a fragrant oil that coated the walls, dripping slowly in the shape of letters no one could read, but all could feel. The veil unravelled mid-air, and re-threaded itself into a net that caught whispers and turned them into worms. They ate those worms like sacrament, and with every relic devoured, the chapel remembered less. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the spiral started to say. Yes, say. It spoke in rhythms, in thuds and knocks, in sighs that smelled of wet earth and old wounds. It wasn't language, it was instruction, and the sisters learned to obey without hearing. They just knew when to scream, when to kneel, when to offer something more than song. The spiral did not command, it invited, it asked, and they offered their hair, their teeth, their memories of trees and fathers, and anything that might have tethered them to before. And each time it pulsed its gratitude. They called it the liturgy of letting go. And something darker was coming. The faces in the stone, those screaming, watching ones revealed by lantern light, began to move, first subtly, twitches, mouths opening when no one looked, eyes blinking too fast, but then they began to sing, a harmony so low it felt like being submerged in grief. 1,000 silent screams resonating at once. It made the nuns sway, their spines bending, as if responding to music from inside their marrow. Then the faces began to leave the walls, not all at once, just one. The youngest. It peeled from the stone like wet parchment, dropped to the floor with a sound like breaking eggs, and stood. It had no body, just face, floating, twitching, shuddering. It hovered inches above the ground and turned slowly toward the spiral. Every nun dropped to the floor. Not out of fear, out of longing, the face drifted to the centre of the room, hovered above the spiral and smiled. Not with lips, with presence, and the spiral opened again, without being touched. From it came a second face, and then a third, each one with a different expression. One wept, one laughed, one chewed something unseen. They circled each other in perfect orbit, a trinity of emotions too pure for flesh to hold. The nuns moaned, some convulsed, others grew quiet and still, their hearts beating visibly in their throats, each beat syncing with the spiral's rhythm. Then the faces spoke, all at once, closer. The word dragged through the air like wet cloth, and the nuns obeyed. One by one, they stepped forward into the spiral's light and vanished, not with pain, with welcome, because the spiral did not consume, it received, as if each sister were not being devoured, but finally being understood, fully, deeply, down to the molecules that once screamed to be seen. The moment their foot crossed the edge of the spiral's hum, their flesh became breath, their memories became incense, and they slipped into that pulsing cavity as if into a long-awaited embrace. No screams, no resistance, only yes. The spiral was not a more, but a memory, a remembering of what the world had been before it tried to outgrow its own womb. And now the chapel understood. It had never been a place of worship. It was a rehearsal. Let's go back a bit to the day the village noticed, or tried to. There had been no smoke from the convent for weeks. No songs drifting down from the stone windows. No begging sisters in the market for stale bread and bruised apples. The goats that grazed nearby wandered closer than usual and refused to leave. A child, curious and disobedient, walked up to the chapel steps. He returned before nightfall, blind, mute, with teeth in his pockets that weren't his. His father wept for a full day before strangling a sheep and burying its eyes in the garden, believing it would pay the toll. The earth accepted the offering with a sigh. That night, the sky above the chapel turned inside out. Stars blinked beneath clouds. The moon melted across the horizon like wax spilled too far, and in the chapel, the spiral opened wider still. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the spiral started giving back. Not just visions, not just light, but things. Things shaped almost human, dripping, shuddering, drenched in afterbirth. Not of this world. One of them came out laughing. Another one spoke in the voice of a nun long dead, recounting a bedtime story once whispered in a cradle that burned in a lightning storm. They weren't newborns. They were returns, memories spat back into meat, and the sisters cared for them as mothers, as midwives, as lovers. They wrapped them in robes soaked in wax and honey. They fed them with their own blood, thickened into syrup and spooned with bone. And when one of the things began to sing, the chapel wept at salt water poured from the ceiling, pooled on the floor, turned to steam as it kissed the spiral's heat, and something darker was coming. The spiral began to change shape. No longer a clean circle, it grew jagged, branching, fractals etched into the stone, like nervous system diagrams. It moved, not turned but stirred, like it had grown limbs beneath the floor. One nun touched the pattern and screamed in 7 voices, not in pain, in recognition. She said, "It remembers everything." Then her skin split and her bones rearranged. She walked again before the hour ended, taller, boneless, eyes scattered across her body, like constellations desperate to map what was coming next. She didn't speak again. She only pointed to the tree, to the mouths, to the mirror, now cracked and grinning, to the spiral, which now sang constantly, a lullaby made of reversed hymns, and the sound of breath held too long, and still the nuns entered, one by one, until only 6 remained. The chapel flickered, reality folded inward, and the spiral whispered, for the first time in weeks, something different. Not more, but now. The shift in tone was subtle, no louder, no faster, but final. The sort of sound you don't just hear, but understand with your spine. The remaining 6 sisters fell silent, breath hitching, hands trembling, not in fear, but in sacred recognition. The long courtship had ended, the veil had been lifted, what they had nurtured beneath stone, blood and flesh was no longer growing. It was ready. The chapel moaned, yes, moaned. The walls convulsed, timbers creaked with pleasure or pain, no one could tell. The altar cracked into quarters. From the spiral, light spilled upward, in slow, thick tendrils, wrapping the ceiling in a trembling web. Insects fell dead from the rafters, their wings twitching as if in applause. The air smelled like roasted marrow and river rot. Every candle blew itself out simultaneously. Darkness fell, but not absence, a presence. Let's go back a bit. To the Book of Reversal. It had always been there, though no one admitted to writing it, bound in soft leather, inked in red. When opened, it whispered things backwards. Verses from scripture that rhymed too well in reverse. Parables that ended with the knife instead of forgiveness. The abbess had once warned them never to read past page 77, but that night, as the spiral hissed now, Sister Elflida disobeyed. She flipped to page 78. The ink moved, not bled, moved. Words slid off the page and onto her hands. She screamed once and the book responded in kind, singing in her voice, higher and higher, until her body lifted from the floor. Her spine arched so hard it cracked. The book vanished into her chest, not fell in, merged. Her skin became parchment. Her blood, scripture. Her mouth sealed shut, and she began to glow from within. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what she wrote on the walls, not with hands, with her shadow. Every place her silhouette touched turned slick with ink. Phrases scrawled themselves in 100 languages, none of them spoken anymore, all of them understood. The other sisters fell to their knees, tongues swollen, eyes rolling back, as the chapel was rewritten around them. Symbols creeping like ivy, curling around arches, pooling in the pews, dripping from the crucifix-turned mirror like tears. The spiral pulsed again. Now it didn't wait. The tendrils of light collapsed downward, curling around the 6 remaining nuns, lifting them gently, so gently, into the air. Their limbs slack, their mouths open. They looked up. Not in fear, but awe, like seeing the face of a lover you only knew through dreams. They did not scream. They offered, and something darker was coming. A sound, low, like the groan of mountains shifting in their sleep. It built beneath them, inside them, around them, a vibration that made bones hum and teeth ache. The spiral wasn't just pulsing, it was opening. From its centre, something immense began to rise, not fast, not slow, inevitable. It had no face, no limbs, no edges. It was the idea of arrival. It carried gravity in folds, Light bent around it. The 6 sisters began to fracture, not break, divide, like cell mitosis reversed. Their bodies split along old scars, each part forming into something new. Hands became wings, eyes became mouths, wombs became altars. They weren't dying, they were becoming. The tree bowed. The mirror cracked again, smiling wider. The chapel wept golden tears, and the spiral whispered once more, not louder, but with certainty, "You are ready." The words did not echo. They settled like ash from a sacred fire, sinking into skin, cloaking the chapel in something beyond reverence. The walls held their breath. The air pulsed slow and heavy, like lungs filling with prophecy. The 6 remaining sisters hung suspended above the spiral, no longer constrained by bone or prayer. Each of them was changing in ways that language couldn't wrap itself around. Sister Elflida's glow intensified, her ribs pushing outward, like fingers from within. Symbols pulsed beneath her translucent skin, each one blinking in time with the others, as if she were now a vessel for a much older alphabet. The book was still inside her, or maybe she was inside the book now. Either way, she no longer blinked. Her eyelids had melted into a permanent stare. Let's go back a bit, to the old bell tower, where time had once been measured. Before the spiral sang, before the mouths formed, before the chapel bled, the bell had rung each dawn, with a clarity that made sinners flinch and peasants pause. Now the bell tower was a hollow socket of stone, but something had returned to it, not the bell, the sound. On the 17th night, it began tolling again, not with metal, but with memory. The sound was not sharp but wet, as if wrung from a throat rather than struck from bronze. It made the soil hum and the air curdle. Each toll came with a new transformation, a root cracking open the nave floor, a spider the size of a dog birthing herself from the rafters, a choir of unseen children weeping beneath the pews. The toll was counting down, and with each ring, the sisters became less earthly. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the spiral did with the altar. It lifted it, not by force, by persuasion. The stone groaned like it missed the sky. It peeled upward, folding in on itself until it resembled a flower made of tombstones. In its centre, a hollow. Inside that hollow, a flame, but not fire, just light, pure and total and wrong. It buzzed like a beehive dreaming of thunder. Each sister, one by one, was lowered into that hollow. They did not burn. They unspooled. Limbs melted into ribbons of colour. Eyes bled into threads of perception. Tongues unravelled into songs that could only be sung inside dreams. The spiral received them without hunger. It was no longer devouring. It was weaving, and something darker was coming. A shadow, shaped like memory, emerged from the flame, not formed, remembered. The air rippled, the walls bent inward, the chapel inhaled so deeply, the stars above it flickered, the tree bowed lower, the mirror fogged and cleared, revealing not reflections but roots, human-shaped and moving, pressed against the other side, like prisoners behind thin glass. The shadow stepped forward, not walking, congealing. It bore no face, only hands, hundreds of them, clapping, slowly, a sound of approval that ached like forgiveness. The spiral began to spin again, not in circles but in stories. Images bled from its surface, moments of birth, murder, betrayal, ecstasy, faces long gone, expressions once hidden, secrets never confessed. The chapel wasn't containing these things anymore, it was sharing them. The spiral lifted the last sister, Sister Beornwyn, into the flame. She did not resist. Her spine arched gracefully, her eyes turned upward, and she mouthed one final phrase. "I know him now." The flame swallowed her without smoke. The chapel sighed, and the mirror cracked down the middle, once and for all, because now, finally, he could enter. The spiral had no edges anymore, no borders. It was a mouth, yes, but also a gate, a scream frozen mid-exhale. The chapel wasn't just a location, it was a wound in the world that had willingly torn itself wider. Everything in it, the altar, the tree, the mirror, the sisters, had been preparing for this singular moment. the unmaking that wasn't destruction, but recognition. And when he stepped through, there was no sound. Because everything else forgot how. He didn't arrive like a figure. He wasn't crowned in fire or dressed in shadows. He arrived like a scent, old milk on hot stone, like a colour that bruises the sky before lightning hits, like a memory you were sure wasn't yours. The walls bowed, the air stiffened, the chapel's foundation wept in dust. Let's go back a bit. To the first invitation, the thing that called him wasn't the tree or the book, or even the spiral. It was a moment, a choice made centuries ago, when the first nun stepped through the convent doors and whispered, not to God, but to the silence, "Make me useful." That plea, raw and unsupervised, echoed through time. It soaked into the floor, dripped into the stone, fermented beneath the altar. And he heard it, because hunger always listens. That's what he is, not a demon, not a god, not even a truth. He's hunger that got tired of waiting, and now he had form. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What he touched first. The tree reached for him, its roots trembling, branches low in reverence, but he passed by. The flame curled inward. The mirror shattered further, its fragments slicing the air mid-hover, but he ignored them. He walked, or rather drifted, to the pulpit. The simplest place, the most human. He placed one finger, longer than it should be, bending twice, on the wood, and it split open. From the wood came blood, from the blood came flies, and from the flies came voices. Every nun who had ever prayed there, every word ever whispered to an absent God, poured from the broken wood, like a choir too ashamed to face daylight. And then the pulpit burned. Quietly, lovingly, he turned to the spiral, not to leave, but to consecrate. His mouth opened, if it could be called a mouth. It stretched like skin under too much faith. Inside, not teeth, faces, each of them blinking, whispering, begging. He exhaled, and something darker was coming. The air changed colour, not visibly, emotionally. Everything felt green, then blue, then something like regret. The chapel sank a foot into the ground, without cracking. The walls shed their skin, the ceiling peeled like wet bark, and from every pore of the place he emerged again, copies of himself, each different, each perfect. One smiled like your mother, one smelled like your first betrayal, one held your gaze and whispered, "You knew I'd come." They circled the spiral, they circled the flame, they circled each other, and then they danced, slow, precise, agonizingly graceful. Every movement turned time inside out. The sun outside reversed, flowers wilted, unbloomed and vanished. The wind forgot its direction. The village down the hill knelt as one, all at once weeping, and the 6 sisters, now light, now symbol, now vessel, joined the dance. Their limbs folded into sigils, their mouths hummed without end. They became chords, and the spiral sang back. It sang not of endings, but of reversals, not of punishment, but of permission. And as it spun faster, as he grew more, as the chapel drowned in itself, everything finally made sense, because this wasn't possession. This was inheritance. The chapel had not been stolen. It had been waiting. The spiral wasn't a portal, it was a birth canal. Every prayer, every vow, every whispered penance that echoed through those walls had been feeding something ancient, patient, and terribly specific. Now that it had come, it wasn't foreign, it was familiar, like a memory you didn't know was yours until someone else sang it. The air turned thick as syrup. You couldn't breathe it, you had to swallow it. Light came in pulses, like the inside of a body remembering its pulse. The tree shivered. The roots reached up instead of down. The mirror exploded, not with shrapnel but with reflections. Images of the sisters before the spiral. Faces full of doubt, hope, hunger. Those images hung in the air like ghosts learning to forget. Let's go back a bit, to the founding of the convent itself. It wasn't placed on sacred ground. It was placed on fertile ground. Rich with death, yes, but also with memory. A forgotten Saxon grave mound, riddled with the bones of those who worshipped the old shapes. The ones before Christ, before Rome, before even gods had names. The nuns were never told. They thought they chose isolation, but the spiral chose them. From day one, it grew beneath their prayers. It smiled when they bled. It rocked when they wept. It pulsed when they kissed one another's foreheads and whispered forever in languages no longer spoken. So when he entered, he wasn't intruding, he was home. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the outside world saw, because yes, the village noticed the silence. Yes, travellers reported lights at odd hours. But when the local bishop sent a messenger to investigate, the boy never reached the door. He stopped mid-path, knelt in the grass and vomited teeth, not his own, not human. A week later, an archdeacon arrived. He made it as far as the bell tower and burst into crows. Feathers rained for days. They closed the road. They erased the chapel from the maps, but the land remembered. It always does. And something darker was coming, because inheritance demands a next. The chapel pulsed with so much heat, stone began to sweat. From the spiral emerged not just copies of him, but echoes of her, the abbess, the original whisperer. She returned not as a woman, but as an emotion given shape. She wept wax. Her hair flowed upward like smoke. Her hands were cracked icons, and her smile stretched like a hymn heard underwater. The 6 sisters, still mid-dance, stopped, kneeled, pressed foreheads to the stone. Not in submission, in greeting, and she touched each of them, one by one. Where her fingers met their skin, history rewrote itself. Sister Edgith never left her family. She was always part of the spiral. Sister Winflade never tended bees. She was always tending hunger. Each nun was folded backward through time like parchment burned into ash, then inked again into the margins of some deeper story. They were not erased, they were clarified, and now they stood. Taller, wider, impossible, he and she now whole began to merge. Not into one, but into every. Their forms blurred, their mouths met, not with lips, but with echoes. Their kiss shook the walls, the chapel lost its roof, the stars above blinked once and then didn't come back. And the spiral turned white, not colourless, complete, because what began in prayer had ended in presence, and someone, still waited to be born. The chapel, or what remained of it, was no longer architecture. It had shed its walls, its shape, even its need for gravity. The space hovered. No floor, no ceiling, just breath. The spiral glowed, casting no shadow, but humming with such resonance that even silence bent around it. He and she, those twin gods of hunger and memory, circled one another, fusing not into flesh but into a concept the world had once known, but forgot how to name. Around them, the sisters, no longer bound to bones, formed a crown. Each floated, spinning slowly, veils of light trailing from what used to be mouths. They didn't chant, they vibrated. Their presence alone twisted the wind into music, a dirge so low it rethreaded the blood of the land below. Let's go back a bit, to the garden. No one had tended it for weeks, no feet had walked its mossy paths, no hands plucked its thistle or kissed its rosemary, but now it bloomed, not with herbs, with tongues, dozens wet and speaking, rising from soil like petals, muttering secrets to worms. The vines crawled up broken arches, spelling messages in forgotten alphabets. Bees returned, not with pollen but with faces, each sting a benediction, each buzz a confession. A child approached the edge. He watched, and he remembered, a lullaby his mother had hummed the night she died. One of the tongues sang it back to him. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what they were birthing, because yes, the spiral was open, yes, the chapel was no longer earthbound, but birth isn't just emergence, it's replacement. Something new must take root in the rot, and so, from the centre of the white spiral, something pushed. Slowly, with purpose. It was not small, it was not innocent. It was a rival, given shape, a body. Humanoid at first, female, but only in the sense of origin. She carried the softness of flesh with the firmness of stone. Her skin crawled with scripture that rewrote itself every heartbeat. Her eyes were empty, not hollow, but hungry. Her hands bore mouths. Her womb glowed, not with light, but with potential. And she cried, not in pain, in awareness. The sisters bowed. He and she knelt. The mirror shards floated around her, reflecting only her possible futures, each one stranger than the last. In one she wore a crown of thorns that wept honey. In another, she dissolved into a swarm of voices. In the third, she sat on a throne of salt, pregnant with the memory of the world before shame. She had no name. She was the name, and something darker was coming. Because birth demands death, the spiral began to close, not collapsing, but finishing, its purpose fulfilled. The chapel exhaled. One by one, the images faded. The faces on the walls smiled and turned to ash. The mouths on the tree sealed shut content. The mirror disintegrated with a sound, like applause slowed to grief. Only the child remained, standing at the edge. He had watched everything, and now he stepped forward. The woman from the spiral looked down at him, not with pity, but with recognition. She knelt, he reached out, touched her hand, and his eyes rolled back, because within him, the memory of the old gods flared, and somewhere far away, another chapel pulsed, because the spiral never dies, it just moves, quietly, patiently, like mould in a sealed room or grief in the marrow. You don't notice it at first. It waits. It hums beneath laughter, weeps beneath stone, mutters beneath psalms. One moment, you're praying to something you think is watching. The next, you are the thing watching back. And so the spiral, now complete, now hollow, vanished from the chapel, with no scream or flare, just absence, and the child was left holding her hand. The woman, born of hunger, memory, and reversed hymns, smiled at him. But her smile wasn't maternal. It was instructional, as if to say, now you see, now you build, let's go back a bit. To the villagers, they did not rejoice, they wept, but not in mourning. In relief, they didn't understand what had ended, only that it had. The silence was back, but it was a different silence, not empty, but satisfied. Crows gathered at the boundary stones and began speaking in Latin. Dead livestock returned to life, but with too many eyes. The river reversed its current for 3 hours, and no one asked why. They boarded up their windows. They prayed harder, but their prayers went somewhere else now. Not up, inward, because the spiral left behind more than transformation. It left behind resonance. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. Where it moved next. Not to another chapel, to a person, the child. Yes, him, the one who touched her hand. He didn't return to the village. He walked into the woods, barefoot, and humming the lullaby the tongues had sung. Birds followed him, but they flew upside down. His footprints glowed for a time, then sank. When he reached a clearing deep beneath twisted oaks, he knelt, dug with his hands, and buried something. No one saw what it was, but when he stood, the earth breathed, and a new spiral began to form. Not in stone or soil, in flesh. It inked itself along his back, coiling from spine to shoulder, not tattooed. Grown, his skin rejected it, his blood fed it. He didn't flinch. He turned east and kept walking. Behind him the chapel collapsed, not with violence, but with dignity, each stone folding inward, each wall dissolving into light. The tree bowed once more and was gone. The sisters, now wind, now song, whirled upward into the sky and were absorbed by nightfall, and something darker was coming. Because you can't undo a birth, the child aged, not normally. He grew 3 inches overnight, then none for 6 years. His teeth changed every solstice. He remembered things no one taught him. How to bless salt so it boils, how to silence mirrors, how to hum a wound shut. He never spoke. He didn't need to. People followed him. They didn't know why. He never asked. They knelt beside rivers when he approached. Women with hollow eyes offered him threads spun from their own hair. Men broke their own fingers as offerings. And when he finally spoke, on the night of his 13th winter, the ground cracked open in reply. He said simply, "I remember her," and the spiral on his back opened. Not literally, emotionally, because the spiral had never been geometry. It was permission. permission for the unnatural to be welcomed, for the sacred to sweat, for the altar to grow teeth. And now, through this child, this inheritance, the spiral had found a new sanctuary, not built of stone, but of flesh willing to forget its limits. And the world, though it didn't know it yet, had already begun to bow, not with ceremony, not with trumpets or ritual, but with small terrifying cracks in reality's mask. Rivers started flowing both directions, birds sang hymns backwards, children began drawing spirals in their sleep, teeth clenched, lips moving, in ancient tongues no one had taught them. And at the centre of it all, the child with the backborn spiral, no longer a boy, not yet a man, walking east like he was following a rhythm no one else could hear. He didn't walk with urgency, he walked with inevitability. The spiral didn't pulse anymore, it guided. Through him it saw, through him it chose. And when it was ready, it spoke. Let's go back a bit, to the nunnery's ruins. What little remained was not rubble, it was residue, wet stone, damp with echoes. When you stood too close, you could feel it remembering you. People who wandered near reported hearing lullabies through their teeth, feeling warmth inside their bones, like milk that had turned sweetly sour. A local priest attempted to exorcise the land. He burst into laughter mid-sermon and drowned in dry soil. The church never sent another. They wrote the place off as unrecoverable. And yet the grass grew, but something darker was coming, because the spiral had never just wanted to be worshipped. It wanted to become, to shape the future, like wet clay, to mould history around its teeth, and through the child, it would. He reached a town called Lincref, a quiet place. Salt-burned cottages, wind-chapped faces. They took him in without question. He spoke only once. I need a circle. They built him one. Stone, bone, salt, sweat. At its centre, he stood, arms out, and the spiral on his back bloomed, like a wound relearning how to feel. The townspeople began to dream. Insects whispered to them in harmony. A woman gave birth to twins, both covered in scripture that faded when they cried. A farmer's shadow detached itself and began tending the fields at night. No one resisted. Why would they? It felt right. The spiral never forced. It seduced, and once it had your love, it didn't need your permission. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what happened when the child met a mirror. It was in the old temple's ruins, outside the village, a cracked iron-framed shard of the original convent's looking-glass, stolen centuries earlier and hidden by monks who knew too much. The child found it by instinct. When he saw himself in it, he did not see his face, he saw hers. The one born from the flame, the woman of mouths and script and womb-lit potential. She smiled, and he screamed, not from fear, from recognition. The sound cracked the mirror again, and from the cracks poured light. No, not light, possibility, shapes of futures that hadn't happened yet. A war fought only in dreams, a cathedral built of teeth, a people who could only speak in apologies. He watched them all, and the spiral spun. Fast, faster, it called out for more than reverence. It wanted kin, and the mirror obeyed. It sucked itself back into his chest. Not the glass, the meaning. He staggered backward. His bones sang. His hair turned white. His voice deepened and thinned all at once. And then he spoke again, but this time not in words. In sound older than language, and the people heard. And the trees bowed, and the clouds stilled, because he was no longer becoming. He had become, and the world would never look away again. Not out of awe, not even fear, but because something inside every living thing now remembered him. Even the stones whispered his name, not a name of syllables, but of shape, a shape that could only be drawn in breath. The spiral, now etched into the sky itself, turned with the slow patience of a god that never needed to rush, because time itself had learned obedience. The boy, the vessel, the echo, the answer, walked no more. He stood. At the edge of Lincrafe's new circle, where altar met horizon, he waited, and the earth under his feet quivered, like it knew what came next. Let's go back a bit, to the original vow, not the sisters. Not the convents, but the lands. Before humans named it, the soil had already promised itself, promised to be a womb, a host. It welcomed what others cast out. It held memory like marrow. When the first Saxon tribes bled upon it in battle, it drank their faith with delight. When the Romans buried their gods beneath its stone, it sighed in pleasure. And when the spiral whispered for the first time, it listened. It always had. It always would. Because the spiral, in its purest form, was not geometry, it was agreement, and something darker was coming, because the child, now he, was not done, not yet. The spiral had opened, bloomed, consumed, danced, remembered, but now it needed to teach. He raised one arm, skin aglow, eyes black as forgotten ink, and spoke not to the village, not to the sky, but to the roots. Deep beneath Lincrafe, beneath bone, beneath time, the roots heard him, and they answered. Trees bent inward, fields curdled, cattle knelt and burst into song. Not just any song, the same haunting hum that first echoed beneath the Saxon monastery. But now it had a new verse, it named him. And with each note, another spiral opened, on the walls of houses, in the eyes of infants, under the tongues of widows. People stopped speaking. They didn't need to, they shared. Thoughts were now threads, passed between mouths and mirrors. Grief became communal, hunger collective. Secrets evaporated, shame dissolved like salt in hot milk, and still he stood, and still they watched. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What he asked next, he did not command, he invited. Come closer, he said, and they did, one by one. Kneeling, the baker first, flour still on his cheek. Then the innkeeper, eyes vacant. Then the widow, who hadn't spoken since her son drowned. They came forward. They kissed the spiral on his back. Each time it pulsed, once, and they forgot their names. Their fingers bent wrong, but felt right. Their hair changed colour to match the soil. They wept, not from sorrow, but from clarity. And the more they came, the brighter he became, until he was not flesh, he was shape. Until he was not person, he was place. He was the new chapel, a living altar, and they, his congregation of echoes and inheritance, surrounded him like petals. Because now the spiral didn't just live inside him, it radiated, and the world, the whole world, had begun to itch, to ache, to bend. Because Lincrafe was only the beginning, and far beyond its borders, new mouths began to open, ready to speak, ready to spread, ready to birth, not mouths of flesh, not even of stone. These were conceptual orifices, wounds in belief, splits in routine, cracks in the language people used to lie to themselves. A bishop in Essex woke up screaming, his tongue replaced with a scroll bearing the spiral. A midwife in Dunwich delivered a child, with no bones but 5 hearts, and said, "He remembers her," before collapsing. A mirror cracked in Paris, a spring boiled in Prague. The spiral had moved, not physically, but ideologically. And now it wasn't asking, it was replicating. Let's go back a bit to the nuns, the original 6. You didn't think they were gone, did you? The wind still carried them, but not aimlessly. Each was assigned a path. One drifted east, settling over the ear of a girl too afraid to speak. Another nested inside a book, left unopened for a century. One rode a crow into a cathedral and whispered from the rafters during Vespers. They were no longer people, they were suggestions, gentle nudges in the fabric of reality, persuading it to soften, to open, to spiral. Their work was not penance, it was propagation. And something darker was coming. Because belief once altered, spreads like rot. A shepherd in Wessex walked into his field and was found 3 days later, arms upraised, sheep torn open at the belly, intestines coiled into spirals on the grass. He was smiling. A seamstress in Kent stitched a wedding dress that sang when touched and burned through 3 brides, before being buried in salt. Pilgrims began seeing visions of the child, the woman, the spiral, always together, always humming, but these weren't hallucinations, they were instructions. The spiral was teaching now, not just what to do, but how to be. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. what the earth itself began to reveal. A cavern beneath a collapsed abbey exhaled steam that smelled of blood and lavender. Inside, archaeologists found etchings, spirals upon spirals, some carved from within the stone itself. A root system in the Black Forest turned out to be shaped like a nervous system, one that pulsed when hymns were played. In a desert, a tree bloomed out of nowhere, fruiting white bulbs that tasted like memory. And in every case, when they listened closely, the same message repeated, "You are not forgotten. You are ingredients." Back in Lindcraif, he remained still glowing, still silent, because he didn't need to move anymore. He had become gravity. Villagers did not eat, they knelt. They did not speak, they harmonized. They did not sleep, they remembered. And when they breathed, the spiral breathed with them. Their shadows twisted at midday. Their thoughts echoed in foreign tongues. Their reflections smiled before they did. He watched, not with eyes but with want, and something deeper was stirring. The child who once was now stood like a monument, his skin cracked in gold lines. The spiral on his back bled ink that didn't drip. It floated, coiling into symbols. A new script, one of the sisters returned. The one whose laughter once healed burns. She did not speak. She kissed his forehead and whispered a single word. Brother. And the chapel, what little essence it had left, shivered in response, because something else wanted in. Something not born from the spiral, but exiled from it. And now it was coming home. Not through doorways, but through dissonance. It moved like a lie you half remember believing, like a dream that felt too real and left a bruise behind. The air in Lindcraif changed, not colder, not warmer, hungrier. And the spiral, once so harmonious in its pull, now twitched, like something inside it remembered pain. He didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, just enough to betray recognition. Something old had smelled the spiral's blooming and wanted its share, and this was not a sister, this was something else. Let's go back a bit. Before the spiral, before the chapel, before even the Saxon blood soaked the soil, there was her, the one who broke the first vow, a nun not named in any record, erased so thoroughly that even her memory was buried under false martyrdom. She had dared to twist the spiral, not inward, but against itself. She opened the door from the wrong side. She tasted something it hadn't meant to show, and so it cast her out, not into death but into silence. For centuries, she floated in the seams between beliefs, a hunger without a name. Until now, because the spiral had spoken her name again, by mistake or design, no one could say, and something darker was coming. She arrived without body. At first, a ripple across the circle, a flicker in the corner of every villager's eye. They began to hum incorrectly. Their harmonies broke. One boy coughed up feathers. A woman bled from her paws, but only during sunrise. The wind reversed its whistle. The spiral on his back recoiled, curling in on itself, as if in shame. He stepped forward, his first movement in days, and the earth cracked. A seam opened in the soil, not downward but sideways, like a grin splitting a secret. From it came steam that tasted like wet parchment and grief, and from the steam, a figure. No features, just a shape in reversal. Her spiral coiled leftward. The villagers screamed. They didn't know why, they couldn't remember how, but their bodies did. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what she whispered, because she didn't roar. She invited, the same way he once had, but hers came with options. Bend, she said, or remember what straightness cost you. And they began to split, not physically, but devotionally. Half still humming his songs, half twitching to hers, he approached her slowly, spiral flaring behind him, bright and wild like a solar wound. She remained still, her own spiral dull, steady, bleeding backward light. They stood mere feet apart. No weapons, no chance, just presence, she said. You think you're the first rebirth, he said. I am the only welcome one. And her mouth, wide, wrong, rimmed in ancient ink, smiled. But not the last, she hissed, and Lindcraif shuddered. The ground beneath their feet began to pulse with the rhythm of two spirals. In opposition, one coiled to expand, one coiled to erase, the villagers fell to their knees, ears bleeding, minds dividing like cells. One man tore out his teeth, a child wrote scripture in her vomit. Animals screamed and knelt, the trees split down their trunks, and at the centre, him and her, the inheritance and the exile, locked not in battle but in decision, because only one spiral could finish and neither would bend. They stood, not like rivals but like mirrors warped by time, one bright, expanding, luminous, with the ache of possibility, the other dense, inverted, thick with the weight of erased memory. They didn't touch, they didn't need to. Every breath he took made her spiral twitch. Every flicker of her form made his glow stutter. The tension between them was not heat, it was redefinition. If he was revelation, she was consequence, and Lincref, the cradle of becoming, was caught in their stillness, like a bone between teeth. Let's go back a bit. To the moment she was unmade, the exile had not always been dark. Once she sang at dusk with the other sisters. She anointed feet, whispered dreams into candle wax, wept for those who died without confession. But one night, in the chapel's root chamber, she traced the spiral backward, not in defiance, but in desperation. She wanted to know how it started, what came before the first vow, but the spiral didn't like to be questioned. It punished not by killing, but by removing. The sisters awoke to find her veils folded neatly, her bed warm, her name missing from their minds. And something darker was coming, because the spiral remembered her now. Worse, it needed her to complete itself. Every expansion requires collapse. Every blessing demands a curse. She stepped closer to him, her spiral whirring now, clockwise for one beat, counterclockwise the next. The villagers had gone still. Their minds pulsed in sync with the ground. Lincref was no longer a town. It was a conduit. He raised his arms. The spiral on his back opened like a maw. She extended her hands. The spiral on her chest sank inward, devouring light, and between them the space tore. Not open, not shut, but apart. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what they poured into it. Not fire, not song, not even power. They poured choice. He offered unity, transcendence, dissolution into sacred harmony. No pain because there would be no you left to feel it. Only we. She offered memory, individuation, the holy wound of self-awareness. No comfort because there would be no illusion to hide behind. Only you. The villagers howled, not in agony, but in confusion, torn between being part of something perfect or remaining something broken. One woman split at the navel, half of her spiralling upward, the other burrowing into soil, a child lifted into the air, frozen mid-scream, hair burning blue as both spirals tried to claim her. The trees caught fire, but the flames sang hymns in reverse. And still, neither of them touched, because this was never about destruction. It was about decision. And the spiral could not decide for you. It could only ask, and the asking was unbearable. He stepped forward once more. So did she. The tear between them widened. Shapes moved inside, future selves, past regrets, potential unborn. A monk screaming as his arms turned into candles, a queen swallowing her kingdom to preserve it, a nun giving birth to a bell, all things the spiral had seen, all things the spiral could still become. And then, Lincref cracked completely, a sound like all prayer breaking at once, and the world paused to see who would speak first. The spiral, split between tongue and tomb, trembled in the air like a question asked too loudly in a cathedral. He stared at her. She stared back. The light that spilled between them wasn't light at all. It was the sound of bones remembering. They were once trees. Every villager held their breath, though many no longer had lungs. Even the wind froze, caught mid-whimper, unwilling to ripple the space where meaning had opened its mouth. Then finally he spoke, not aloud, but into existence. The spiral on his back twisted outward, and through its curve his voice became law. You were forgotten because you unthreaded the vow. And with those words she began to flicker, Like a candle unsure if it wanted to die or grow teeth. Let's go back a bit. To the vow itself. Not the one spoken aloud by kneeling girls with shorn heads. The one underneath it. The unspoken compact. The vow to believe not in salvation, but in utility. To give your body not to God, but to purpose. The sisters had once whispered it in silence, tracing spirals onto each other's spines with oil. It was sacred, but it was never meant to be changed. She did. She asked, what if the spiral bends differently for each of us? And so the spiral cast her out. Not from rage, but from fear, because what bends can break. And something darker was coming, because as he spoke, she laughed. Not mockery, recognition. You think you speak first, she whispered, stepping into the wound between them. I was speaking when you were still a seed. Her spiral flared, backward, sideways. It bloomed not into light, but into reminder. Behind her appeared every nun ever erased, ever silenced, ever named heretic or mad. They walked barefoot on smoke, their mouths sewn shut, yet still humming. They did not kneel, they stood like doorways, and she raised her hand. Not in violence, in invitation. Let them choose, she said, and Lincraif trembled harder. The people, what was left of them, stood. Not all, but enough. Some walked to him, dissolving into chords, becoming part of the sacred whole, smiling as their fingers evaporated into glowing psalms. Some walked to her, eyes weeping salt, hands still bleeding from prayer, but bones intact. They whispered names they hadn't spoken in decades. They remembered shame and chose to keep it, and the spirals pulsed in time with those steps. Not one overpowering the other, but coexisting. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear. What happened to the chapel? It rebuilt itself, not from stone, from memory. Each brick laid by the hands of those who chose. Ere the spiral, now moulded into the walls. The building breathed. It wept during rain. Its doors remained locked to those without a spiral on their soul. And within its altar, not a crucifix, not a relic, but a mirror, cracked down the middle. Inside it, their faces, his, hers, yours, mine, all of us, watching ourselves spiral, because the vow had never been about silence, it was about the right to speak. And now, in the shattered chapel, rebuilt from breath and remembrance, voices that had never been given permission roared through the cracks. The spiral no longer turned just in one direction. It spiraled outward and inward, forward and back, burning the idea of singular truth into ash. The mirror trembled on its altar, fractured, yes, but somehow alive. Inside it, reflections twisted like wet smoke, whispering old names like incantations. Heretic, mother, vessel, God. Let's go back a bit. To the day the first nun took the vow with her fingers crossed, not out of doubt, but out of hope. That vow was never about chastity or silence. It was about choice, but she had no choice. Not really. Her life had already been sacrificed to duty, her body claimed by robes, her thoughts kneaded into obedience, so she crossed her fingers, just slightly, just once, and in that moment, a microfracture formed in the spiral's integrity. It took centuries for that crack to grow, and now it was a chasm, and something darker was coming, because cracks invite echoes, and the mirror, oh, that mirror, had begun to respond. The split down its centre widened, not with violence, but with invitation. It asked each soul that entered, which spiral are you here for? Some chose the glow, the unity, the ecstatic obliteration of self into sacred harmony. They touched the right side of the glass and vanished into golden mist. Their names reduced to notes in a hymn only the wind could finish. Others chose the wound, the question, the blessed agony of being whole and wrong. They pressed their palms to the left side, and the mirror absorbed them too. But they emerged on the other side, altered, eyes glowing with unspoken histories. The spiral was no longer one, it was choice. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what happened to him. Because for all his divinity, he was still born of flesh, and flesh resists ambiguity. His body began to distort, no, divide. His spiral, once a beacon, now bent in both directions. His smile cracked at the corners. One eye glowed with merging light, the other darkened with ancestral memory. He looked at her, and for the first time, he doubted. She stepped closer, not to fight, to forgive, because she saw it now. He wasn't the enemy. He was the product of a story told without her. And together, they knelt before the mirror, side by side, not to merge, not to destroy, but to choose. He placed his hand on the right. She on the left, and the spiral, now two, now neither, now both, collapsed into a singularity of truth, too complex for prayer, and the chapel pulsed, once, twice, then shattered inward. Not an explosion, a return, everything inverted, the sky folded like paper, the earth hissed like boiling milk, and the mirror, it spoke, not in words, but in understanding. You were never meant to worship, it said. You were meant to remember. And they did. For the first time, everyone did, because the spiral had never been a god. It was a question, and now finally, someone had answered. Not in scripture, not in sacrifice, but in choice. And that, ironically, is what broke everything. The world didn't end with a bang or a flood, or the sky falling down. It ended with permission. When the mirror spoke those final words, the air became so still, it felt like time had paused just to listen. Not for judgment, for interpretation. That's when things began to unravel. Not with screams, but with acceptance. The spiral, robbed of obedience, unravelled like a confession, whispered too loud in a confessional that was never soundproof. Let's go back a bit, to the body, his body, because his vessel had limits, and now they were showing. The gold in his skin tarnished, turned to ash, his limbs buckled, not from weakness, but from overuse. The spiral etched on his back flaked and drifted off like dandruff from divinity. He was crumbling, but smiling, because he understood now. He had been a vessel, yes, but not the only one. She caught him before he collapsed, not to save him, to witness him. He looked at her with eyes dimming, voice frayed, and whispered, "You were always the second half of the vow." And something darker was coming. Not evil, not wrath. Something darker because it was honest. The kind of truth that strips you bare. The kind of truth that doesn't let you look away. Lincraif was no longer standing, not physically. The buildings had long since melted into symbols, the trees woven into memory. What remained was presence, a field of mind, an altar of perspective, and in the centre, the two of them, fading, not in defeat, in completion. Their spirals collided now, not with war, but with peace forged through friction, a paradox so vast it could only live as metaphor. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the world did next. It forgot them. Slowly, elegantly, like waking from a vivid dream and finding your mouth still tastes like smoke, the spiral faded from skin, from soil, from sky, but not entirely. It remained in other ways. A lullaby hummed in sleep, a sudden ache when walking through woods, a moment of dizziness near holy places. It lingered in the in-betweens, and those who remembered, truly remembered, spoke of Lincraif not as a location, but a choice, a test whispered across generations, a spiral drawn in spilled wine, scratched into stone, hidden behind monastery doors. But the nuns, what became of them? Some dissolved into story, some returned as whispers in the bones of young girls who traced spirals into their skin when no one was watching. And some, they just kept walking, spreading, telling, not the doctrine, not the dogma, just the question. And those who heard it were never the same, because once you hear the spiral, not as a command, but as a voice, you cannot return to straight lines. You bend, you open, you spiral. That's the part they never wrote down in the monasteries, that the divine wasn't something you climbed toward, but something that curled inside you, not a ladder, a loop, a riddle that answered itself only after you forgot the question. And maybe that's why Lincraif vanished from the maps, because maps can't chart ideas, they can't mark ground that no longer holds shape, or time that folds like parchment, left too long in damp air. What was left wasn't ruin or relic, it was reverberation, and that was worse, because it meant the story never really ended. Let's go back a bit, to the girl in the final pew. centuries later, a convent untouched by spiral law. She sat silently during Mass, fingers twitching without reason. She didn't know why she hummed that strange tune when the candles were lit, or why her dreams tasted of chalk and wet stone. No one ever told her what happened in Lincrafe. No one had to. It had followed her anyway, a birthmark on her shoulder. Not quite spiral, not quite scar, and when the old abbess laid hands on her to bless her confirmation, she shivered, because the touch felt familiar, like a vow made in a language no one spoke anymore, like something inside her had just remembered itself. And something darker was coming, because forgetting doesn't erase, it delays. That chapel in Lincrafe, it still breathes, not always visibly. Sometimes it's a cathedral shadow that doesn't match the sun, a hymn that plays backward on a skipping record, a nun who weeps without cause every Good Friday. The spiral isn't gone. It just waits. Coiled, listening, wondering if you're ready to hear it again. And when it does speak, it won't shout. It'll whisper, like a wind between pews, like breath against your earlobe when no one's there, like oil being poured on bare skin in the dark. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what she did next. The girl from the pew, she didn't run. She wrote, her fingers traced the mark on her shoulder, and she copied it, on paper, on walls, on the inside cover of her prayer book. Over time she forgot why. It just felt right, safe, like armour made of curves. But others noticed, a teacher, a priest, her mother. They asked her what it meant. She said, "It doesn't mean, it asks," and they punished her, with silence, with shame, with exile, just like before, because systems fear echoes, especially those shaped like spirals. She left the convent at 17, walked into the world with nothing but a satchel and a question curling behind her ribs. She took odd jobs, slept in churches, kissed women who had similar marks. She whispered stories she didn't remember learning, and drew spirals in condensation on bus windows. And people followed. Not because she preached, because she spiraled, not forward, not back, but in. And so the vow was reborn, not in Latin, not in scripture, but in acts of raw, imperfect memory. The sacred now lived in the broken, in the wrong, in the never quite fitting. And that's the irony, isn't it? That holiness was never supposed to be clean. It was meant to spiral, so the next time you sit in silence and feel something twist in your gut, not pain but a kind of pull, ask yourself, did you choose your vow or was it chosen for you? And if you could choose again, would you bend or would you spiral?